was going to say when I came this morning how very pleased I was that Pam asked me to come and speak. However, when I was a student in the School of Journalism about 1,000 years ago over at the U, I had a professor, Mitch Charnley, who one time told me, never use the word very in a news story. And if you were inclined to do that, substitute the word damn. And you never use it. So by university standards, I'm damn pleased that she called me and asked me if I come over. Okay. How's that? Very good. Anyway, I'm glad I'm here. I'm always a little concerned that there's somebody in the audience that knows more about my subject than I do. I think that's true this morning. I think Tom's around here somewhere, and he knows a lot about Lake Minnetonka history. Well, anyway, I feel a little bit like Charlie Brown. I love Charlie Brown stories, and one of the most famous shows all of the Peanuts characters lying on their backs, looking up underneath a tree, looking up at a summer sky with lots of clouds, and Lucy, who's always in charge of everything, says, what do you see up there in those clouds, Schroeder? Now, Schroeder is the musician, if you recall, and Schroeder looks up and he sees the bust of Beethoven in the clouds. He sees the score for the Moonlight Sonata, all kinds of wonderful things. And then you see Charlie Brown's face, and his mouth is going like this. And then she says, and what do you see up there, Linus? Well, Linus, of course, he sees Moses and the Ten Commandments in the clouds and all kinds of wonderful things. And then you see Charlie Brown like this, and she says, and what do you see up there in those clouds, Charlie Brown? And Charlie Brown says, well, I was going to say a ducky and a horsey, but I changed my mind. And that's the way I feel sometimes when I think there's somebody out there that knows more about my subject than I do. Anyway, I'll take just a minute or two to tell you how I got here, why I'm doing this sort of thing. 50 years ago, I was a newspaper editor in Excelsior, and I edited 2 weekly newspapers. And in 1953, Excelsior celebrated their 100th birthday. And so we did a historical centennial edition, which won a national award. And so people began to ask me to come out and speak about Lake Minnetonka history to groups very much like this one. And wherever I spoke, somebody would say, you ought to write a book, you ought to write a book. Well, there'd been a couple of good history books already written. Blanche Nichols Wilson wrote one called The Minnetonka Story, and there was another one over in Wayzata, the librarian at Wayzata, Thelma Jones, wrote one called Once Upon a Lake. Anyway, I decided I wasn't going to write another history book, so instead I'd write a novel. So it took me about 10 years to write my first novel. I wrote the first 2/3 of the book, and I put it away in a dresser drawer somewhere about 2 or 3 years. Then I took it out and I finished the last third, put it back away again somewhere. Somewhere along the line, somebody in Wayzata who knows something about publishing asked if he could read my manuscript, and he encouraged me to send it to New York, which is why we lose electricity.
You'll just need to speak loudly to us.
Okay, we'll do the best we can. Anyway, I not only sent it to New York, I took it to New York. I took the manuscript to Scribner's, which is an old publishing house on Fifth Avenue and in New York. But I promptly got all those copies back again. Nothing happened. So that didn't work very well. In the meantime, I'd been on Boone and Erickson's show on WCCO radio one morning talking about Lake Minnetonka history, and Charlie had read the manuscript. And a publisher in St. Paul heard me and came out and picked up a copy of the book at the Old Log Theater, and about 3 or 4 days later, I got a very nice note back saying, I like the way you write and the way you develop characters, and when can we get together and talk? And I can assure you, it didn't take very long for me to get together and talk when it was with a publisher. So I went over to St. Paul to have lunch with him, and on the way over I thought, you know, if I can talk fast enough, I'll con this guy into publishing my book. And so we sat down for lunch, and before I could say anything, he said, do you think it ought to be a soft cover or hardbound? Boy, I said hardbound so fast to make your head swim, and that's how I got my first book published. All of my books now are The hardcovers are all out of print, but we have 3 of the 4 are in softcover. Anyway, this was the first book. It was called Excelsior. It takes place in the year 1887, and it takes place on the 4th of July weekend. And back in 1887, the 4th of July fell on a Monday. So this book takes place on a Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. It's a love story and an adventure story. And if you dreamed how you wanted your first book to look, it wouldn't be any better than this. And so you have to remember this is quite a while ago. So I sent this off to 4 or 5 or 6 friends who'd been in the Air Force with me during World War II. And I got nice notes back from all of them saying, gee, we're so happy for you and so proud of you, and our kids have read the book, we've showed it to our neighbors, and there's all kinds of nice things. One guy couldn't stand it. He called me from New York and said, I just have one question to ask. And I said, what's that, Jim? And he said, is that a recent picture of you on the back cover? And I said, yes, it is. And he said, well, boy, are you well preserved, because I know how damn old you are to begin with. At any rate, that's how I got my first book published. And I always wanted to write about my childhood, growing up in the 1930s in the Depression. But my publisher called me and said, I'd like to have you write a murder mystery based on the Catherine King murder case, which took place in 1894 in Minneapolis. Minneapolis is the most famous murder case. And so I set everything else aside, and and I wrote my second novel. And I took characters from the first one, put them in the second one. And the second book is called The Ozark Flats. And the title comes from the fact that most of the people that were involved in this murder actually lived in an apartment house on the corner of 13th and Hennepin, downtown Minneapolis. And it was called the Ozark Flats in those days. Now it's called the Bellevue Hotel and its condominiums. But at any rate, that's how I got started at doing all of this. And then he said, now if you want to go ahead and write about your childhood, do that. So I did. I wrote my third novel, which is called Good Luck on Your Downward Journey. Strange title, and later I'll tell you where it came from. But it's about growing up in the 1930s. The year is 1934, and you see everything pretty much through the eyes of 2 12-year-old boys growing up in Excelsior. One from a very wealthy family, and the other one from a family that doesn't have any money at all. And that doesn't mean anything to the kids. And we were very successful at that. So I wrote one last novel, and by that time I had grandchildren from the first book in the 4th book. And the last book is called The Island House. And it takes place in Mackinac Island, up in Lake Huron, not to be mistaken for Madeline Island. This one's up in Michigan. And that's where they have no cars on the island. You either walk or bike or take a cab, which is a horse and carriage. And it's still that way today. I think that's why I like that place so much, is because it reminds me of what Lake Minnetonka was like back in the 1880s and the 1890s. And the Island House is the oldest hotel on the island. Patty and I have been going up there for the last, well, we started going up in 1864 and 1964. I get my years straight. And you know, I'm really not that old, although Patty says I'm so old she spells it O-L-D-E. But at any rate, we've been going up there a long time. And when we came back last June from our last trip up there, it was our 73rd trip to Mackinac Island. And they let me write whatever I wanted to about that hotel, which was really kind of nice. And a few years ago, they put a plaque up on the door next to the room that we've been staying in for the last 25 years. And it says, in Mackinac Island, the Island House, in honor of Bob and Patty Williams, author, guests, and lifelong friends. And so when we were up there last summer, the young manager of the hotel said, I booked a honeymoon couple into your room this summer. And they read the plaque, and they just had one question to ask. Is the room haunted? And he had a great answer for it. He says, not yet. So who knows what's going to happen down the line. And the other thing about that community up there, in the summertime, there are 4 churches, and they all do well in the summer because there's lots of tourists. But in the wintertime, that little community of Mackinac Island shrinks down to about 500 people. And only 2 of the churches stay open. One is St. Anne's Catholic Church, and the other is Trinity Episcopal Church. And both of those are just hanging on by their fingernails because there's not a very big community there. And I give them credit for staying open and doing what they can. Anyway, about 3 or 4, for a long time, in the wintertime, those two churches do some things together, like they do a Christmas bazaar, and then they give the money to the local clinic, and some nice things like that. Well, about the last 3 or 4 years, they've been doing a communion service once a month together. Usually once in St. Anne's, and then the next week or the next month it'll be in Trinity. And finally somebody went to the Catholic priest and said, isn't that against the canon law to be doing a communion service with those Episcopalians? And he thought for a minute and he said, what are they going to do to me? Exile me to some little island with a small parish? Which is already where he was. So I thought that was a wonderful remark at the end of this. So anyway, I do historical walking tours for the Excelsior Chamber of Commerce, and I get more questions about the 1930s than any other time period. And I always found that kind of interesting. I'm a product of the Depression, and I'm proud of that. I'm even more proud since Tom Brokaw wrote The Greatest Generation. But I cherish those times that we lived through, but I wouldn't want to do it again. Yet at the same time, those Depression years created values for life that some of us still carry with us today. So a lot of good things came out of that, even though they were very tough times, very tough times. This recession was nothing like the Great Depression. And like all writers, I spend a lot of time doing research. But when I talk about things that I can remember, and I have a very good memory, then I can tell you things that maybe nobody else can tell you because they haven't experienced them. But at any rate, we're going to talk about the Depression years today, about growing up in the Depression. Mostly what I'm going to tell you just comes from memory, either about my family or the amusement park at Excelsior or the Twin Cities in general, or sports or movies, or what downtown Minneapolis was like. So today we're going to talk about those Depression years, all from memory. And I hope that will prompt some seniors that are here that are about my age to remember some things that they've forgotten about in their growing up years. And when you're younger, you're going to learn something about history that maybe you didn't know before about the Depression. So we're going to get on with that and see where we go. It was the time of Franklin D. Roosevelt, 32nd President of the United States. It was the time of Floyd B. Olson, Governor of Minnesota, and Harold Stassen. It was the time of the Lindbergh kidnapping and the trial of Bruno Hauptmann in New Jersey. And every night we listened to the radio to H.V. Keltenborn telling us about that trial that was going on in New Jersey. And those are vivid memories. And that time period, it was the time of the death of Newt Rockne of Notre Dame, and Will Rogers, the humorist and the movie star, and Wiley Post, the aviator with a patch over one eye. Those were all things that were going on back in those days. The other day I thought, there are so many automobiles that were made back then that are gone now. We don't see them anymore. They're out of business. They have been for a long time. So I listed some, besides the ones that we know today. Some of the others that were prevalent back then were the Model T Ford, the Model A Ford, the Stutz Bearcat, the Hupmobile, the LaSalle, the Willys Overland, the Whippet, the DeSoto, the Pierce Arrow, the Studebaker, the Packard, the Cord. You could go on and on with all kinds of, they're all gone. There aren't any of those left at all. And my dad suffered a stroke cranking one of those cars and died at the age of 47 years old. And we're talking about a whole different era here. You've all heard this phrase, the greatest thing since sliced bread. We've all said that at one time or other. Well, I'm so old I can remember when sliced bread came out. The bakery was afraid that when they sliced the bread that it was going to fall apart. So they put every loaf in a little cardboard tray, had a little lip on it, and then they wrapped it in their orange and blue wax paper. It was Zinsmaster bread. It was by the Zinsmaster Baking Company. And it was about 1928 or 1929, right in that time period, when sliced bread came out. Well, Can you imagine, even as late as the year 1934, the Northland Milk Company was still delivering milk in South Minneapolis with a horse and wagon. They'd drop an anchor to keep the horse from moving anywhere, and then they'd go and pedal it. This is back when milk came in bottles with a bottle cap, you know. And they were still using horses to do that. I grew up in Excelsior, but during the Depression, my family would move back to Minneapolis during the school year because that's where the jobs were. If there were any jobs available, that's where they'd be. So I can remember we'd go down to, we always lived in an apartment around Lake Minnetonka, and then we came back out again in the spring. So I started school in the fall in Excelsior, then we moved to Minneapolis and went to Calhoun grade school, and in the spring back to Excelsior. It was not a very good system for a kid who wasn't too smart to begin with. And but at any rate, we would go down to 28th and Lindale, where Northland Milk had great big horse barns to take care of the horses where they delivered milk. Can you imagine that in 1934, still using horses and wagons at that point? I couldn't get over that. And Bambi Bread did the same thing. Delivered door to door. That whole time period was about Bernie Bierman and the Golden Gophers and about the Minneapolis Millers baseball team. And they played on holidays like Memorial Day and the 4th of July and Labor Day. They would play a doubleheader with the St. Paul Saints. And they'd play in the morning at Lexington Park, and then they'd play in the afternoon at Nicollet Park. And they did that on all the holidays. It was the time of radio with Fibber McGee and Molly and Jack Benny, and it was the time of movies with Mickey Rooney and Shirley Temple and Clara Bow and Clark Gable. You could go on with movie stars forever. And out at Excelsior, we had the Excelsior Amusement Park. And it was the most popular attraction in the state of Minnesota. I could go anywhere in the state and somebody would say, "Where are you from?" And I'd say, "Excelsior." "Oh yes, we've been to the amusement park." Everybody in the state had been to that amusement park at one time or other. The amusement park was built in 1925 by the F.W. Pierce Corporation out of Detroit. And they had other parks around the country. In fact, they had another one in the Twin Cities at White Bear Lake. It was called Wildwood. So you could go by streetcar out to White Bear Lake to Wildwood, or by streetcar out to Excelsior to the Excelsior Amusement Park, which was the biggest of their amusement parks and their favorite. And it was a wonderful amusement park. And during the Depression, the amusement park was having a tough time because nobody had any money. So they tried some different things to draw people in to the amusement park. One thing they did was something called milk bottle cap days. You imagine this now, on some Saturdays during the summer, the park ran milk bottle cap days with one milk bottle cap. Now this is when milk came in bottles with a little cardboard cap. And with one milk bottle cap and 3 cents, you could ride on any ride in the park. So people came out on those Saturdays with one pocket full of milk bottle caps and the other one full of pennies. And they'd spend the whole day riding on all those rides at the amusement park for 3 cents in a milk bottle cap. And when I look back now, it's hard for me to believe all of that, but it's true. Well, that worked for a while, but they needed something more. And so the amusement park hired a series of circus acts, and they were free to the general public. They were called free attractions. So for 1 week or maybe 2 weeks, you'd see Smith's diving ponies. And the diving ponies would walk up a ramp and dive into a tank of water. Everybody thought it was great. And the next week, you'd see Wilno the Great being shot out of a cannon. And the next week, it would be Oscar Babcock doing a loop-the-loop on the bicycle. Every week or every 2 weeks, it was a different. And they did shows every day, every night at 10 o'clock and twice on Sunday to try to draw people into the amusement park. And the biggest attraction of all was Captain Jack Rogers, who climbed up a 100-foot ladder and dove into a 5-foot tank of water. Now that's a gutsy act, I can tell you. Actually, the ladder was only 87 feet tall. And the tank of water was more than 5 foot deep. When they put the tank in, they dug down in the ground about another 10 feet and put a tarpaulin in there. And so he had about 15 feet, but it was still really an exciting act. Captain Jack would come out in his white circus tights and flying helmet and climb up that ladder and put his back to the audience. And then he'd keep his body very rigid. And then he'd just simply fall off and make one complete circle and land feet first in the water. But before he did that, they poured kerosene on the top of the water and lit it with a torch, a flaming torch. So he had a flaming tank to dive into. It was spectacular. It would be a spectacular today if somebody would do it. But Captain Jack did it, and everybody loved him for it. So those were exciting times. And just before Captain Jack dove off of the ladder and into the tank, the public address announcer would say, "Captain Jack, whenever you are ready, you may go. And good luck on your downward journey," which is where the title comes for the book about the Depression years, where we went down and watched Captain Jack. Anyway, right across the street from the Excelsior Amusement Park was probably the biggest and the most beautiful dance floor in the state of Minnesota. And all the big bands came to play there. Tommy Dorsey and Glenn Gray and the Andrews Sisters were there, and Lawrence Welk. And Ted Weems' orchestra came to town with I think about a 20-year-old handsome young boy whose name was Perry Como, singer. And he was here at the Excelsior. They called it the Excelsior Park Ballroom. Later in the 50s and 60s, it was called Big Reggie's Dance Land, but it was the same dance floor, and it was absolutely beautiful. And let me see what else I want. Well, I'll tell you, dancing was popular back in those days. You could go down to the Excelsior Park Ballroom any night in the week in the summertime and find anywhere from 100 to 300 or 400 young people dancing. High school age, college age, young marrieds, middle-aged, few old guys like me. But basically, it was a young crowd. And either I was terribly dumb or terribly naive, I don't know which. But I don't ever remember anybody ever getting in a fight. I don't ever remember anybody out in the parking lot slashing tires or stealing wheels. It was a gentle time. Everybody got along, whether you came from North High School or Washburn or Chaska or St. Cloud. We all got along and liked each other. When I look back on it now, it was amazing that there wasn't more things going on with that many people. You had 400 youngsters at one time in that dance floor. Anyway, I always amazed every time I think about that. And the Excelsior Amusement Park was probably the first and only attraction at that time that had group sales. Everybody does group sales today. It doesn't make any difference whether it's the Minnesota Twins or Orchestra Hall or the Renaissance Festival or the Olog Theater. They all sell groups of one kind or another. And back in those days, the Excelsior Park was the only one I know of that sold groups. And they sold them so that on any particular Saturday, you would see all the employees and their families from Pillsbury or General Mills or Honeywell or the Zura Shrine, and they would come out on Saturday and spend the whole day at the amusement park, riding all the rides, having a big picnic lunch, and then they'd walk down 2 blocks down along the lakeshore to the Excelsior Commons, which is the most beautiful civic park you ever can imagine, right on the lake. And they would run all kinds of races down there for the families and kids. And they had big metal bins of ice cold pop and beer. It was all free, big chunks of ice in it. And it just so happened that I lived in the neighborhood right across the street from the park. And so all of us kids would go over and run in the races and win the prizes and take them home. They didn't know our dad didn't work for Honeywell or Pillsbury or whoever it was. And it was all free to us. And we didn't have any money anyway. And then we were back the next day to pick up bottle caps. Pick up bottle caps where the refreshment stand was. And we were very careful. We only picked up the ones that didn't have dents in them. They had to be perfect. and we traded bottle caps like you trade baseball cards today. Like one Coca-Cola was worth about 4 grape, probably. And we did that, and then what we would do is, you have to remember now, we didn't have recreational directors, we didn't have anybody to tell us what to do, we didn't have any money, so we had to make our own fun. So we would take the bottle caps, and on the inside of every bottle cap, there was a cork lining. I can see people are already shaking their head, they know what I'm going to tell you. And what we would do is we'd take an ice pick and pick the cork out, and we would put the bottle cap on the front of our shirt. Then we'd take the cork and run it up underneath the shirt and push it back in again. We walked around, we looked like General Eisenhower. We had all of these bottle caps on our shirts, and it was free. We made our own fun. And I look back on it now, it's hard for me not to have some good feelings about that time period. And but we didn't have any money, so we had to make up our own fun. Well, anyway, down at the Excelsior Commons, there used to be an inlet off the lake, just big enough to put the one remaining streetcar boat that was on the lake at that time. And they would put it in there in the winter to protect it from the ice. And then in the summertime, that little inlet was just covered over with green slime and lily pads, and there were a lot of carp in there and that sort of thing. And as 12-year-olds, we would go over there, and there was lots of shrubs around and all bushes and things. And as 12-year-olds, we would go over there and pull the lily pads and the lily pad stems out of the lake. And then we would dry the lily pad stems on the rocks in the sun. And then we'd smoke them and get sick. And then we graduated to stealing coffee out of our mom's kitchen. And we smoked coffee in corncob pipes, which was worse than the lily pad stems, if you wanted to know. But it was free to us. So, and then finally, we figured there was one of our group that looked old enough to where we could send them into Arnold's drugstore to buy a package of cigarettes, either wings or 20 grand. They were 10 cents a pack. And of course, I don't tell all my grandchildren all of these stories. I only tell some of them. And I'm not sure if you're taking notes for West Tonka or not about all that. At any rate, those are things, though, of the times. That's how we lived, and that's how we played back in those. Those days. Life was it was free to us. So, and then finally, we figured there was one of our group that looked old enough to where we could send them into Arnold's drugstore to buy a package of cigarettes, either wings or 20 grand. They were 10 cents a pack. And of course, I don't tell all my grandchildren all of these stories. I only tell some of them. And I'm not sure if you're taking notes for West Tonka or not about all that. At any rate, those are things, though, of the times. That's how we lived, and that's how we played back in those days. Life was a lot simpler then than it is now. And like any young boys in that time period, I had a paper route. And there were lots of papers to choose from. There was the Minneapolis Tribune, both a morning and an evening edition. There was the Minneapolis Journal, Minneapolis Star, later on the Minneapolis Times. I happened to peddle the Minneapolis Star, which was 2 cents an edition and 12 cents for the week, because they didn't have a Sunday paper, with just Monday through Saturday. So every week I would collect 12 cents from each of my customers. And if I had a customer who was 2 or 3 weeks in arrears, I was in big financial trouble. I can tell you that right now. Anyway, my paper route included the Excelsior Main Street, which was only about a block and a half long. So at 12 years old, I knew every businessman on the Main Street, and they all adopted me because they knew my dad had died when I was about 10. So we got along just fine. And one of my clients was a young lawyer by the name of Neil Grathwold. Now, Grathwold is an old family in Excelsior. It goes way back. There used to be a Grathwold dairy there in the 1920s. Anyway, Neil was probably one of the first of his family to go to college and to earn a law degree. And he was one of my clients. And so he opened an office, he came back to his hometown and opened an office on the second floor over Arnold's drugstore. Where there were some doctors and dentist offices up there and the telephone office. But he had an office up there. And on his very first day as a lawyer, he opened up the door and went and sat behind the desk, and he could see right out the door of his office, and he could hear somebody coming up the stairs and walking right towards him. And he wanted to look successful, so he picked up the phone and began an imaginary conversation. And sure enough, the guy came and stood right in his doorway. He said, "I'll be with you in just a minute." He finished up the conversation, hung up the phone and said, "What can I do for you?" And the man said, "I'm here to connect your phone." And it's a true story. You couldn't make that up.